this containerization process and the kind of evolution of global trade was, as you mentioned in the book, kicked off by this guy named Malcolm McLean. Can you talk a little bit about who Malcolm was, his upbringing, and kind of maybe some of the characteristics that led him to have a competitive advantage in this field?
Sure. Let me start by saying that there was a lot of dissatisfaction around the world with the way shipping was operating in the 1950s. It was acknowledged pretty widely that it was very inefficient to have a lot of dock workers on the dock lifting one little package at a time to put it into the hold of a ship. And there was a lot of talk about how do we make shipping more efficient? How do we make dock work more efficient? And a lot of governments, some railroads, different companies had tried this idea of putting these little parcels and boxes and so forth into some kind of metal container. That was not a new concept in the 1950s. It had never proven to be a viable concept in an economic sense. Some of the transportation regulators didn't like it, but also there were some practical questions. Okay, you've put the stuff into a container. Well, the ship isn't really designed for a container, so the container is taking up space inefficiently in the vessel. You get to the end of the voyage, you've taken the cargo out of the container. What do you do with the container? It's not like you've got a lot of other customers sitting around waiting to send the container back where it came from. So do you just write off the container? Do you melt it down? If it's a wood container, do you chop it up and use it for firewood? Those sorts of questions had led to the conclusion that container shipping was not viable, was not an economically sensible option. So along comes this guy named Malcolm McLean, who started out driving his own truck in North Carolina during the Depression. And out of that, he built a big trucking company. It was one of the largest trucking companies in the United States. McLean was known as a very effective businessman. In the days of regulation, rates for example, interstate trucking had to be approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the truck line had to show that it was profitable, that it was not price gouging, that it was not submitting a rate that was artificially low just to get the business. So if you wanted to submit a lower rate than your competitors, you had to have lower costs. You had to have a more efficient operation. And so that's how Malcolm McLean had come to grow in the trucking business. He grew concerned in the mid-50s by the increase in traffic on the roads. His trucks mostly moved between the Carolinas, New York, and New England. And this was an era when there was very rapid growth in the number of cars on the road. We didn't have a lot of expressways yet. The trip was taking longer. It was less reliable. And he was looking for a way to save costs on this trip. How can we make it more reliable? We don't want to pay a driver just to sit in traffic. And so his thought was that maybe you could put the truck on a ship and sail it from North Carolina up to New York or up to Boston. That's where he started in probably 1953. That was his idea. And as he developed this, it was clear it didn't really make sense to put a truck on a ship. You had the truck cab taking up space, so let's just put the cargo part of the truck on the ship. And he played with that for a while. It was clear that that didn't make a whole lot of sense either, because you still had these big wheels and chassis on which the cargo was resting. All of that had to go on a ship, so you couldn't stack trucks on board a ship. So then the discussion became, well, suppose you could just take the part of the truck that's holding cargo and put that on a ship and leave the rest of the truck behind. And that was where the idea for what we now call containerization came from. So he did some experiments. He found an engineer to help design containers that might work for this process. He bought a small domestic ship line because back in those days, again, transportation domestically was regulated. You just couldn't just send a ship off. You needed your route approved by somebody. It was easier to buy a little ship line that already had the authority to serve certain routes. And then he was forced by the Interstate Commerce Commission, the regulator, to sell his truck line because the ICC thought it wasn't right for a company to be both in the maritime business and in the trucking business. So McLean bet the ranch. He had his prospering truck line. He sold it all and really committed himself fully to developing this idea of the shipping container. His first voyage was in April of 1956. He had 58 containers that were carried on the deck of an old tanker ship, a leftover tanker from World War II, from Newark to Houston. 58 containers is pretty modest by what you see today, but back in the day, that was revolutionary. Nobody had done this before. And this really began the process of convincing businesses that it made sense to use container shipping, understanding the economics of container shipping, developing a whole network of ports that could handle it and ships that could handle containers, and really building an industry from scratch. It started in a much smaller way. And people tend to talk about McLean setting out to change the world, turning him into a great hero. But he wasn't setting out to change the world. He was setting out to make his trucking business more profitable by avoiding congestion on the freeway.